Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us from wherever in the world you happen to be. Thanks also to our distinguished panelists who've joined us for this occasion. Thank you to Alistair Sponsel and Sam Weiss-Evans for providing the logistical, administrative, and moral support for bringing off today's event. I'd like to begin by explaining a little bit what the observatory is and what kind of event this is, and then move on to the proceedings. So our thanks first and foremost to the Templeton Foundation for an extremely generous grant with which we can sponsor a series of conversations that we think are warranted around the technologies that are broadly talked of as human genome editing. Our hope is that through events such as this, but through a number of other activities as well, we will broaden the scope of the questions that are being raised around genome editing and also open up new pathways for deliberating as a worldwide humanity on the purposes, functions, limitations, benefits, and burdens of the suite of technologies that we think of as genome editing. So gene editing, as it's often called, or genome editing, it sounds extremely simple, and people focus in on the edit word. And I've heard scientist after scientist talk about the fact that this is no different from running a spell check that picks up the spelling error and corrects it. But of course, if you've written anything, you know that the spell check is an iffy instrument and it doesn't pick up random errors that you yourself make. For instance, I often end up typing THEN when I mean THE, but my spell check will not correct that because it recognizes THEN as a perfectly good word. And maybe it'll look at the context if it's a smart enough machine, but maybe it won't. So editing is a somewhat dangerous metaphor to bring to even correcting English prose, let alone correcting the human genome. And we've been involved in conversations about the complexity of this topic for a very long time. So just as editing conveys a false impression of the precision of the instrument, so genome conveys a somewhat false impression of the object at the center of our inquiry. What is it that we want to correct? And although many people who are familiar with the idea of gene editing will focus in on the precision, the accuracy, the exactitude, yet somehow the very same people often also speak in very grandiose terms about what this conceitedly revolutionary technology implies. So you hear about editing humans, you hear about editing the human species, you hear about redirecting evolution itself. By the time we're talking about grand purposes, such as redirecting the future of the human species, it is surely time to stop and ask, well, who is in on these conversations? Who should be in on these conversations? Under what auspices, raising what kinds of questions, and with what certainty or assuredness of being heard when they're raising these questions. So for these purposes, the Global Observatory for Genome Editing is intending to carry out 3 separate functions. The first one, of which you see an example today, is convening. So we want to bring together groups of people who we think are in a position to shed light on the profound questions raised by the technologies of gene editing. But in addition to that, we also propose to conduct a curating function so that our website, whose URL will be posted for you to see, so that our website actually carries resources with which people can think about the issues. And the third function that we want to also serve is an analytic function, bring to bear the best scholarship and thinking on the series of issues that are raised for individuals, for their families, for their communities, for their nations, and for their species, and indeed for other living beings through techniques of gene editing. So we have a fantastic lineup today of people who will launch what we hope will be a long series of conversations on this topic. And in order to introduce them, let me introduce first my colleague, friend, and collaborator, Professor J. Benjamin Hurlbut, Ben for short, who will take it over and tell you more about today's function and about the speakers whom we have invited to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheila. So as Sheila has indicated, the questions associated with this technology and the issues that it raises are, of course, much broader questions than questions of this technology. And it's in that spirit that we have convened a conversation that looks beyond genome editing, indeed to the ways in which questions of the good maybe are asked or are not asked in relation to developments in science and technology in democratic society. So the title of our event is Democratic Imaginations at the Frontiers of Science and Technology. And we have a very distinguished panel of speakers who will initiate a conversation for us that we hope then to continue with all of you today and well into the future. It's in that spirit that the observatory seeks to convene such conversations, to catalyze in the hope that they continue well beyond the spaces temporal and cyber of the conversation that we'll be initiating today. And so before I introduce our distinguished panel, let me say that that there is a Q&A function. You click on the little bar where it says Q&A, and we invite you to raise questions that we will then turn to in an extended question and answer session. You can feel free to ask those questions even during the talks if you so wish, and we'll gather them and respond to them in due course. So let me move on to introducing our distinguished panel. Our first speaker will be Andrew Jewett. And let me say also, I'm going to give just brief introductions and the more extended biographies are available on the website. Our first speaker today will be Andrew Jewett. Andrew Jewett is the Martha Daniel Newell Visiting Scholar at Georgia College, a historian of American thought and culture. He has also taught at Boston College, Harvard, Yale, NYU, and Vanderbilt. And he is the author of a brand new and really excellent book entitled Science Under Fire: Challenges to Scientific Authority in Modern America. Our second speaker will be Marcy Darnovsky, who is Executive Director of the Center for Genetics and Society, a civil society organization that has been a leading voice in the ethical and policy debates about genome editing and more broadly about biotechnology and the human future. She holds a PhD in the history of consciousness from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Our third speaker, Andrew Feenberg, is Professor of Philosophy of Technology in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, where he also directs the Applied Communication and Technology Lab. One of the leading thinkers one of the leading philosophers of technology in the world. His most recent book, which I also recommend to you, is Technosystem: The Social Life of Reason. And finally, our fourth speaker will be Jenny Reardon, who is Professor of Sociology and the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her innovative work explores issues of identity, justice, and democracy in science and technology, particularly in domains of genetics and biotechnology. And her most recent book, which I also highly recommend, is The Post-Genomic Condition: Ethics, Justice, and Knowledge After the Genome. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew Jewett.
Thanks so much, Ben. As I've been thinking about the themes of this event and the connections between my historical work, which is on mainly US political culture in the 20th century, and our own time, I keep coming back to a concept that was developed by a literary scholar named Timothy Melley about 20 years ago. Melley was writing about fiction and film in the decades after World War II, and he saw running through a lot of that work a tendency he called agency panic. It's a concept that's rarely been applied outside literary circles, but I think it's relevant in lots of other areas as well, including some of the questions about science, technology, and governance that we're taking up today. So what is agency panic? Let me give you a few of Melley's words. Melley explains that agency panic starts with intense anxiety about an apparent loss of autonomy or self-control, a sense that individual autonomy is disappearing in key areas, that we no longer control important aspects of our lives. Sometimes even a fear that individuality as such is disappearing in all of its manifestations, that we no longer control anything or even exist as individuals. In the mid-20th century, Melly finds examples of agency panic across the political spectrum. He details conservative versions, liberal versions, radical versions, but he argues that all of them presuppose and work to reinforce a familiar mode of individualism. And as he puts it, I'll give you some more of his words, agency panic attempts to conserve a long-standing model of personhood, a view of the individual as a rational, motivated agent with a protected interior core of beliefs, desires, and memories. And this emerges particularly strongly, he says, when that familiar understanding of human behavior faces significant new challenges, as it did after World War II. Changes in our world of experience, changes in how we view that world, or both. So on the one hand, new social structures, new modes of social regulation that guide us in subtle and obscure ways. In the US after World War II, for example, the period he's studying, these included large bureaucratic organizations, new techniques of mass communication, forces that seemed to take all kinds of choices out of the hands of individual agents. And then there were new modes of perception as well. Again, in the post-war case, sociological accounts of human action, interpretations that emphasize structural forces, all of the ways in which behavior does not reflect individual choices. So Melly suggests that agency panic works to shore up the conventional view of personhood in the face of these challenges. But it often does so, he shows, by finding new kinds of agents in new locations, by relocating agency to the systems themselves that control us. So we may have lost our agency as individuals, but he notes the controlling organizations are themselves agents, rational, motivated entities with the will and the means to carry out complex plans. Each organization, even the whole system, is seen as a self-governing super individual with its own intentions or goals. So this assumption that social behavior somehow has to reflect a conscious, coherent will is reinscribed under these larger systems, and they're said to control us not just externally, but also internally. Social control is now total. It takes the form of a bodily violation, an introjection of the social order into the self. These are Melly's words again. An imagined penetration, invasion, and occupation of the individual's formerly private and protected interior. So Melly sees agency panic as part of a long-running battle between what he calls a social constructionist concept of the self, one that recognizes how social structures regulate our behavior, and the traditional individualistic understanding. Looking around us today in the early 21st century, I think we see a lot of agency panic. For example, I think it shapes the refusal of many groups to acknowledge systemic or structural racism. We may also see it in the fears of some people that their votes no longer count, the individual and with it democracy has gone out the window. And of course, responses to the pandemic, especially vaccination, the literal injection of governmental power into the body. But I want to emphasize 3 points of direct relevance to the work that the Global Observatory and related groups of scholars are doing. The first involves the remarkable difficulty in getting Americans, at least, to understand how science and technology regulate our behavior, or even that they regulate our behavior. The difficulty of getting across basic principles of research in the STS field. It's not just discourses about the objectivity or naturalness of science and technology that make it hard for these approaches to gain a purchase. It also has to do with conceptions of agency and the self. And Melly points out that agency panic starts in exactly the same place as sociological analysis. As he put it, it recognizes the obscure sources of social regulation, the way persons are regulated by large systems in this manner that violates this traditional understanding of autonomy, but it then recoils at the idea that we're actually shaped by these impersonal forces and instead sees that control as the result of external imposition by another willful agent. We can't let go of the sense that our behavior must reflect some kind of agency, some assertion of an agent's will. And in fact, Melly sees what he calls a national fantasy of subjectivity, a broad cultural refusal to modify a concept of self that's deeply entrenched, even though it can't account for these central features of modern societies. So if that's the case, at least in the US, then we as scholars face certain kinds of obstacles. with that dynamic operating among our audiences, the perspectives of STS researchers will continue to seem counterintuitive, even threatening. And again, not just because they challenge traditional understandings of objectivity, though that's a big part of it, but also because they challenge traditional understandings of subjectivity, of human agency. Second point I want to make relates to this new book that Ben mentioned, Science Under Fire. I look there at suspicions of science in the US going back to the 1920s, and I focus the narrative around a particular mode of cultural criticism. It's one that blames the cultural influence of science for many or all of the social problems we see around us, in particular science's portrayal of human behavior. Scientists misunderstand human action. We've embraced that misunderstanding. We've come to live in a thoroughly scientific culture. We see ourselves that way now, and as a result, our lives are fundamentally disordered. Another way to read the material in the book is to say that in the US, there's been a tendency among certain groups of commentators to identify science or technology or some kind of rationalization process as this super agent that agency panic constructs. The willful force that's shaping our world, even shaping us from within. To the extent that science and technology are viewed that way, any specific field like biotechnology will appear as the product of a kind of alien agent with inhuman or even anti-human values and goals. And my book shows these are not just recent developments. They didn't just emerge in the 21st century, even in the wake of the 1960s. In the US, they go back at least a century, even though the specific contours have changed over time. Certainly not unique to biotechnology or any other field. At the same time, there's also a third point that is specific to biotechnology, especially this prospect of editing the human genome. There are some parallels with artificial intelligence as well, because with genome editing, there's not only a loss of agency, but also a gain in agency, which also intersects with these conventional understandings. So on the one hand, there's a sense that we're losing our agency in a way to our genes, to our bodily structures, and also to the people who have the knowledge and skills to manipulate our genes and the institutions those people occupy. But at the same time, we're also gaining the capacity to reshape our bodies and thus aspects of our behavior in unprecedented ways. So you see that one kind of resistance to the genetic enhancement of human beings among critics like Michael Sandel has to do with this extension of agency, this new form of control over ourselves. Sandel's objection is that we'll stop seeing our bodies and their capacities as gifts and start seeing them as simply another form of raw material to be molded to our wills. Our bodies will no longer constrain our agency in the familiar ways. So if the US at least exhibits this national fantasy of autonomous individuality and the forms of agency panic that often go along with it, then genome editing intersects in particularly complicated ways with that tendency in our culture and our politics. It can both challenge and reinforce that fantasy of autonomy and of control. So I'd be eager to hear how all of you think about agency in relation to these controversies around genome editing, and whether a new round of agency panic or perhaps a new kind of agency panic might be at work in these controversies.
Thank you very much, Andy. Marcy, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sheila and Ben and the other folks at the Global Observatory for organizing this conversation, and also for the suggestion that I share some thoughts based on my experiences at the Center for Genetics and Society over the past more than 20 years now, about what, in their words, how NGOs that oppose scientific and technological overreach can push back without incurring charges of being anti-science. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the Center for Genetics and Society. As Ben mentioned, we're public interest and we consider ourselves a social justice organization. We work to encourage responsible uses and effective societal governance of the full range of human biotechnologies, and to ensure a future in which human genetic and reproductive technologies benefit the common good. We work with other progressive advocacy organizations focused on reproductive, disability, and racial justice, and on LGBTQ and human rights. And we work with publicly engaged scholars across a wide range of disciplines. Our approach to these efforts, like that of many other progressive NGOs, means that we have to look hard at the likely societal implications and consequences of what we've termed in this session frontier sciences and technologies. And we assess them against our aspirations for greater social equality, inclusion, solidarity, and the capacity to democratically shape our collective future. So in other words, we prioritize social values over discovery or innovation per se, and social consequences over technoscientific curiosity for its own sake. We make a habit of questioning the power that is so often ceded to what we call science and what we call technology to shape the future, and to advantage or disadvantage particular communities. And we make a practice of examining the ideological assumptions and institutional interests, that's to say the social relations and power dynamics that are embedded in particular scientific projects. Much of our work falls into the buckets of public communication and policy education, but we also find on many occasions that we need to venture directly onto scientific terrain. And again, that's something we share with many other NGOs. Increasingly, I think in recent decades, many advocacy and public interest groups that don't necessarily start out directly engaging the politics of science soon find themselves diving deep into carcinogens or carbon dioxide, into megatons or messenger RNA. So for us, that means keeping up with key developments in human biotech research, and especially so when there are divergent interpretations of that research. For example, when some studies claim success in modifying the genes of human embryos, while others find what they have dubbed chromosomal mayhem. And sometimes we wade into the technical weeds, for example, to scour the methods sections of those embryo editing papers to see how many eggs per cycle were retrieved from the women who provided them. When we speak to lay audiences, we typically give them broad brush technical information about, in this example, human gene editing. And that's in part to encourage them to see that they don't have to be scientific experts to participate in the ongoing debates that we're describing. Now, we don't present ourselves or consider ourselves to be technically expert, but we do work hard to get what we say about the science right. And I think we've succeeded pretty well. We've been attacked and criticized on many, many grounds and occasions, but we have seldom been accused of errors or misstatements about the science. And we found that this commitment to a reasonable level of technical capacity does provide some minimal defense against the charges of being anti-science. But whether those charges are leveled at us or at other NGOs, I think depends far more on how the particular fields of concern align or misalign with this simplistic and unfortunate pro-science versus anti-science framework that we see at all the yard signs. So if you're an NGO focused on the climate emergency, for example, then you're seen to be standing against climate denialism and alongside the scientific consensus, even if scientists employed by fossil fuel companies might dispute what you say. But on the other hand, if you oppose, say, genetically modified agricultural products, then you're easily tarred as anti-science, even if your objections to GMOs aren't grounded in anything technical or their safety profile, but in their likelihood of destroying the livelihoods of farmers in the developing world. So our experiences on human biotech issues that we've raised over the years have varied depending on how the pro-science, anti-science winds have been blowing. When we opposed the first California ballot initiative back in 2004 that allocated billions of dollars of public funds to embryonic stem cell research to be controlled by an agency explicitly exempted from all government oversight, we were often called anti-science because stem cell research at that moment had been so firmly slotted into the pro-science, anti-science framework. But responses to our opposition to human germline modification, heritable genome editing, haven't been anywhere near that virulent. And I think that's to a significant extent because the scientists themselves are so divided on the issue. Now, it's still quite possible that designer babies will become a new front in the culture wars. If it can happen to Dr. Seuss, it can happen to CRISPR. But short of that, responses from the scientific elite to our work as an NGO opposing heritable genome editing still leave a lot to be desired. So as you know, the scientists who have put themselves in charge of the controversy about heritable genome editing started out in 2015, acknowledging that the decision of whether to go forward with it required not just evidence of technical safety, but also what they called broad societal consensus. I was an invited speaker at the 2015 summit where that pledge was made. And though I was the sole speaker from an NGO, the meeting did also hear from a historian, from several philosophers, from several sociologists. And you also probably know, if you've been following this debate about heritable genome editing, that since 2015, the commitment to broad societal consensus has been rolled back considerably. There's still widespread lip service to the need for public education and engagement, but the contrast between those calls and the lack of any follow-through is striking. Public involvement, let alone the higher and better, in my opinion, standard of real influence that Françoise Baylis calls public empowerment, that doesn't just happen. To make public participation in deliberations about heritable genome editing meaningful, inclusive, and effective would take careful thinking and design, sufficient time, and hard work backed by material support. But the point I want to stress here is related to that, and it is that one way that even the diminished commitment to public engagement is undercut is by ignoring or disqualifying civil society groups. In other words, the public's role in this debate has consistently been conjured but steadily undermined. And within that shrinking space for the public, there seems to be no room at all for organized public interest in the form of NGOs or advocacy groups. So I'm going to mention just a few of the trends that we've noticed, that although I think there is the risk of sounding whiny, and I don't mean to do that. So for example, we've been told, and this was by a scientist involved with a public consultation process on heritable genome editing, that the contributions of advocacy groups were literally not counted because they are seen as having an agenda. In other words, we have a point of view and thus can't possibly reflect something called the public. We've also seen numerous articles about the heritable genome editing controversy that will mention some critics without giving a single name or any link to information from a critical perspective. And we've noticed that when our writings are cited, they give our affiliation with the Center for Genetics and Society, but rarely, if ever, have anything to say about what CGS is or about the many civil society partners we work with. And finally, my colleague Katie Hassan points out that discussions of public engagement tend to portray the public either as some kind of monolith or as atomized individuals, each holding their own personal opinion. And this is yet another way that civil society gets written off. Now, some of these moves have come from scientists eager to move ahead with heritable genome editing, who clearly have a motivation to dismiss our perspective. And others seem to derive from often unconscious assumptions about who counts in controversies at the frontiers of science and technology. So it won't surprise you to hear that, in my view, NGOs and civil society organizations have to be key players, must be key players, and belong as key players in democratic imaginations at the frontiers of science and technology, and in any progressive politics of science. The umbrella mission of NGOs and social movements, social justice movements, and organized civil society is, in fact, to envision the future we want and to struggle to build it, often with leadership from marginalized communities who clearly see how current power imbalances and inequities could play out through the new technologies. And failing to include them, excluding these perspectives, impoverishes our democratic imaginaries as much in science policy as anywhere else.
Thank you, Marcy. Andrew. Sorry, Andrew, you're still muted. Do you mind unmuting and restarting?
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to talk about democracy in science and technology in terms of a model that's familiar primarily from medicine. It's the model of the lay-expert dialogue. Obviously, the public can't influence science by voting. That's not plausible. You can't vote for the truth or falsity of a theory. So what I call democratic interventions are the way in which the public intervenes in science and technical policy. These are public actions, for example, protest movements or expressions of opinion. They might be identified by polls or by letters to the congressman that concern a particular scientific technical issue. So these democratic interventions are addressed to a relevant technical community or scientific community. And the hope is that the community will respond with appropriate changes in the matter under consideration. And we've seen quite a bit of this since the 1970s in medicine and the environment. There's well-established interactions that have practically refuted the notion of the complete autonomy of science and technology. That used to be an article of faith. Today, we no longer hold that view of science and technology. We see them as part of the public world. Now, there are obstacles to initiating such dialogues. There are three that I'll mention. There is the continuing notion of an expert autonomy, an autonomy that's so complete that any intervention by the public would be simply irrational. There's also on the side of the public anti-intellectualism, a rejection of science. And then finally, there's propaganda, often initiated by businesses that have an interest in a certain outcome. But fruitful dialogues do occur where the propaganda is ineffective and the public appropriates enough technical knowledge to make some kind of sense of what's going on and use that knowledge to point out blind spots that experts have not understood or identified, which they can correct. Dialogue, Ben, I don't see the clock.
It's up there. If you maybe shuffle your top bar, push the arrow, you'll see the clock. You've got a little less than 7 minutes.
Okay. The dialogue between science and the public is possible because science and technology are already based on the everyday life world in which the public bathes. The science and technology refine and perfect concepts that are found in the life world and introduce them into a disciplinary context of some sort. So what happens in the dialogue is that the experts are brought back to the life world ground of their own specialization. Now that life world ground is teleological and anthropomorphic. That's its nature, and it therefore differs radically from what scientists take for a rational approach to the facts. But nevertheless, there is a way in which that teleological view in the life world can enter into science and technology. And it does so primarily through what I will call object constructions. The object that the science pursues, the way it understands its object, is to some extent tributary of the public interest in the activities of the science. So for example, the body as studied by medicine is a tiny subset of human physiology. That human physiology as a whole contains myriad interesting facts and issues that have no relevance to medicine or only a most remote relevance. And those are simply eliminated, and medicine focuses on things that are significant. Its object, in other words, is the human body as in the life world we understand it as sick or healthy. And we can see a similar thing with climate. An infinite number of parameters could be studied, but we focus in the climate science on those which are relevant to human civilization. So we've defined climate as an object in a certain way in function of a public interest. Well, genetic engineering has this quality as well. We see a transition in recent years from DNA as an object of study to DNA as a technical object related to human concerns. Now, there are two main areas of concern, which I'll mention briefly, and these are human genetic engineering of the human genome and agricultural genetic engineering. The education of the public around therapeutic interventions into the human genome is inevitable, if only because every time women get pregnant, they have to have a discussion with their doctor about genetic diseases. So genetic engineering will become more and more familiar as time goes on to the general public, which will allow it to form opinions. But there's also, in addition to therapeutics, there's also a lot of discussion now of enhancement. Now, I can only conjecture here, but my conjecture is that the enhancement issue is not going to have the importance that people tend to give it in fields like philosophy of biology, where it's an exciting problem to discuss. I think the reason is foreshadowed by vaccine resistance. We already see how something as innocent and significant for people's welfare and well understood as vaccines can pose a major problem of public resistance. Now, in the case of vaccines, of course, we focus primarily on propaganda as the source of this resistance. But in the case of genetic engineering, there's also an issue of principle. When you're trying to make a significant and difficult technological advance, you're sure to make mistakes. We see this with nuclear power. Despite a lot of propaganda in favor of nuclear power, a few serious mistakes have pretty much killed it in most countries. And I think the same thing will happen with enhancement. The human tolerance for genetic errors of involving human beings seems to me likely to be very small. I think we have good, of course, philosophical reasons for protecting the human genome from these experiments in enhancement that have to do with diversity and the arbitrariness of the particular criteria that any given culture might try to impose on the genome of future humans. But in the life world of ordinary people, I think this will be reflected in a notion of the sacredness of the existing genome. So I think regulation will pretty much limit us to therapeutics as far as people are concerned. Agriculture is a different story. There's already been quite a bit of work modifying organisms. This has provoked resistance, but also enthusiastic advocacy. And so you see a big difference, for example, in the relation to agricultural work in the US and Europe. I don't really know how to imagine the future of this particular type of genome editing. I guess it's impossible really to judge the ultimate consensus that may someday emerge. But in any case, I believe it will conform to the model of lay expert dialogue that I've described here.
Thank you very much. Jenny.
Hi, and thank you for the invitation to take part in the launch of the Global Observatory, which is something I'm very interested in. I hope we can discuss because I've been very interested and intrigued by the idea, and I think it offers us a really interesting model to work with. So I've been asked to talk about the adequacy or inadequacy of institutions in fostering inclusive deliberation on advancing biotechnologies. And I'm going to draw upon lessons from work in human genomics, which I've been studying for the last, quarter of a century, actually, by now. But these lessons are, I think, similar to ones we can glean from the experiment of American democracy, perhaps because at the heart of both are deeply contentious questions about the constitution of rational knowledge about the human and the problem that race poses to that Enlightenment project. And I want to go back to a meeting that Sheila Jasanoff actually organized, I think, over 2 decades ago. I think it might have been 1999 that this meeting happened. And Michael Blakey, who is a biological anthropologist, was speaking at that meeting. And he and I were having a, as you do when you get to gather live, you have those little corner conversations. And we were talking about the tension then at the time. This was right when there was a debate about whether or not Rick Kittles, who was Michael Blakey's student, was creating a company called African DNA that was going to take that the issue was Blakey had been the lead scientist on the African Burial Project, which was the first effort to study African DNA. And Rick Kittles wanted to develop that work and turn it into an ancestry company. And there was a lot of tension over that. Was that an appropriate use of African DNA? And what Michael explained to me is that there were these tensions here about whether or not, he referred to it as a kind of moment of, do you join the bandwagon? Do you become a part of genomics? Do you try to reform it? And he framed that as a kind of Martin Luther King approach, or is there a kind of a Malcolm X approach here that this is just all the wrong thing, we shouldn't be participating, I don't believe in the values of this, and we need a whole separate, different way of doing things. And in current parlance, we might think of this, thinking of the work of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. Do we, using their technical terms, pull this shit down? Or do we need to completely reconceive the human in relation to other concepts, as the Jamaican writer and critical theorist Sylvia Wynter has argued? Is the foundation all wrong, and will participating in deliberations act to legitimate the wrong worlds? A world where we might edit out what we perceive as the flaws with humans rather than deal with more systemic social stigma. And so, this actually came up in the gene editing case, where one of the main reasons that Hug gave for why he was creating what became known as the CRISPR babies was discrimination against people with HIV/AIDS. There were already technical capacities to do what Hug wanted to do, and really he was addressing a social problem. And so was that the right approach? Should we instead be dealing with social stigma? So I guess my first point and observation based on the history that I think it's relevant for today is that inclusive deliberation, of course, is not always an unallied good. It depends on when one is included and who is included and in what one is included. And this point was permanently seared into my consciousness in early field work I did in a number of places, but I'm just going to highlight work I did in Tuskegee, Alabama at the turn of the millennium, when I actually went there to study an effort which I saw as a productive effort, a positive effort to democratize science, to include the voices of African Americans in policy discussions about genomics. And what I found when I was on the ground there is that that project was facing a lot of resistance, because people were saying things like, the church fell down in this community on a Saturday. What if it had happened on a Sunday? There's no hospital here. We'd have to go to 40 minutes away. People would be near death by the time they got there. So why do we spend our time on genomics when what we really need is a hospital? So are we building the wrong world? And these questions fall outside, and this is where I think the observatory can play a role, because I think as you state, one of the purposes is to broaden the discussion from, did we inform people, did they give their consent, to, which is a classic bioethics issue, to a question of social justice, which is, what kind of world are we building and for whom? what are the aspirational aspects of world building that get left out of these overly narrow and constrained discussions about bioethics, but are really what are on the minds of people on the ground usually. They're not usually concerned about, you know, the informed consent form. That model, I think, which was, and it's interesting that Tuskegee is the place I was talking about this, because the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, of course, was perhaps the main reason why we have informed consent. But I think, you know, nearly 50 years on from that, that is not adequate for dealing with the problems that we face today. And the other point I would say is that inclusion at the wrong points can create more harm than good. So we have the continued problem of conceptions of science and technology as separate from ethics or politics, that there can be purely technical projects, and these projects need to get their work done before we, the public, can see what might need to be deliberated. And here, I think, as many of us have begun to say, there's need for ontological work. That is, we need to do the institutional work required so that we don't continue to have whole sectors of, for example, the National Human Genome Research Institute that conceives of itself still as being merely technical, like the sequencing program. Technology is the wrong order of thing. We need an order of thing. We need institutions that do not bend discretely like this, where you have a sequencing program and then you have the ethics program, but rather we need to work relationally. And when we have the wrong spatial order, the problem is we get the wrong temporal order. Ethics gets added later, at the point where it may do more harm than good to add it, because at that point, all the choices have been made. So what is your role as someone who's being included in ethics at that point, other than legitimating what's already and ratifying what has already been produced? But if that's the dilemma we're in this order of things, in this spatial temporal order of things, what do? Can we refuse? This is if we do refuse, the politics of refusal, are we framed as, what are the risks of that? We're framed as being irrational, as not being team players, as, as not being good. So my next point, of course, there are questions about who is doing the deliberating, and this is in response quickly to Marcy. And I think it's interesting to think about whether or not scientists should be included, because we often think, oh, the public has diverse views, but so do scientists often. And so I think it's worth speaking about that. And then the point Marcy also made about who is deliberating, how critical can you be and how organized can you be in order to be able to be included in this rational space of deliberation. Here you can see that what I'm getting at is a critique of deliberation is way too liberal and rational in a way, which leads to, my next point is, where is the space of contention? When we really conflict, how do we deal with the conflict? And because I only have a little bit of time throwing a lot on the table here, the next, I think, issue is what kind of material support does deliberation have? We're spending billions, trillions developing better sequencing and gene editing techniques, and we're still spending pennies on the equally complex, and if you want to use that word, technical work of building the trust and practices needed to democratically deliberate in any kind of fashion about these enormously consequential acts. And what I love about the Global Observatory is that it implies that someone is building a big, expensive telescope. And there ought to be a lot of money for that, is what I have to say. One thing I said in the book that Ben kindly mentioned, my last book called The Post-Genomic Condition, is that we have just over the last several decades divested in the arts of collective judgment. And the arts of collective judgment are difficult to build, and they must be built, and they require resources. And then finally, the question that's already been raised of what kind of power will these resources have? When we speak, we can speak, but who is listening? And what kind of material force does speaking and listening have in the world? Will anything happen? I love the purpose of the observatory, to serve as a corrective to the prematurely narrowed questions, perspectives, and modes of deliberation that have come to dominate in influential scientific and bioethical arenas. Amen. Yes, that is true. But how does that actually happen? How do we get heard? And these were questions that were being raised decades ago by Indigenous rights leaders. So I talked with about the Human Genome Diversity Project. They said, yeah, we can talk, we can speak, but what's going to happen as a result? And is there any enforcement mechanism? Where, as Marcy put it, is the follow through? And so I have lots I'd love to discuss.
Thank you, Jenny, and everyone for those wonderful comments. So discussion is now the order of the day. So we will turn to questions from the audience, but I think we'll begin with a little bit of intro discussion panel. And so first, let me invite the audience to put your thoughts and questions and so forth into the Q&A. Once again, that's on the bottom of the bar of your little window where we're all popping up in our boxes. But for now, let me invite Sheila to ask the panel a first question.
Yeah, well, thank you to all of you, but Jenny, for making this such a composition in the round and by cycling back to some of the issues that Marcy raised, and let me firmly echo Ben's invitation for the audience to put their questions into the Q&A, because very much we intend to get to those audience questions as soon as we can. But listening to all of you, and particularly to you, Andrew, or Andy Jewett and Marcy, I was struck by this contradiction, Andy, that you raised. You said that the threat is not, the perceived threat from the criticism of science is not just to cultural notions of objectivity or the idea of objectivity writ large anyway, but also to subjectivity, to the kind of person that Americans on the whole think themselves to be and have taken themselves to be. So this is, of course, a sort of instantiation of what we in STS call co-production. I mean, we say that you produce these worlds, the kind of world that Jenny was talking about towards the end of her comments. We envision a particular world, but in that world, we have ideas in our mind of what kind of people are the right people and the good people to be inhabiting that world. So taking all that on board and seeing that it is very consistent with what we say in science and technology studies, but Marcy's entire enterprise, of course, also tells us how complicated that idea of identity in a nation is, because, of course, it's a nation in which there are progressive critics of science of the sort that Marcy represents as well. So let me ask you, Andy, I mean, let me ask you two faces of the same question. I mean, so first of all, Andy, for you, to what extent in your historical work have you found that there are critics who question this subjectivity of the American as a particular kind of person and therefore wedded to a particular kind of science, whether it's in the context of behaviorism or anything like that? I mean, so what historical precedents are there? And turning to you, Marcy, to what extent have you found that it's possible to persuade people of the other persuasion, if we will, who are often these liberal rationalists that Jenny was talking about, that something else needs to be taken on board? And I ask that as myself, a pedagogue and an educator, and we have lots of science students who meander into science studies, and it is striking how many times in a given year I will hear that STS for them was a conversion experience, that they really learned to think about the world in a different way. So I am not, of course, hopeless that even very well-entrenched subjectivities can be, got to look at the world from a different standpoint. So Andy, the historical side of it, and Marcy, the democratic persuasion side of it, I wonder what you could say more to what you've already said.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. In a way, it's not at all confined to STS, these kinds of patterns that I'm talking about. And these sorts of tensions are really coterminous with the social sciences going all the way back, right? I mean, insofar as they invoke any sort of transhuman fact, or even sometimes when they just talk about institutions, it's a kind of perspective that devalues some of these understandings of individual self-determination. I certainly hear the kind of caution about generalizing across a national culture, and I do think that some of these patterns have changed over time. But of course, in comparative terms, it's not terribly controversial to say that Americans have tended to have an extravagant sense of their own kind of individual power. I was thinking, in relation to some of the work you've done and others, there is an interesting sort of constraint on agency in American political culture, insofar as typically elected and appointed officials are not supposed to be exercising a lot of subjective will of their own. They're supposed to be sort of taking a popular will and combining it with technical tools and technical constraints without really interjecting themselves. And that sort of then reserves all of the agency as it's imagined for the people, however that's constituted. And the disjuncture, and maybe I'll turn over to Marcy here, the disjuncture between the people as we continue to imagine them, it, us in the United States, and the actual on the ground with all of the institutions and with all of the exclusions and so forth. That's where a lot of the real action is.
Thanks, and thanks for the question, Sheila. It's an interesting one. I was thinking about, I'm not familiar with that, the idea of agency panic, Andrew, and I would like to think more about it. But one thing that comes to my mind immediately is that to the extent that there's a panic about identity as an individual, that is in part, I would guess, linked to the erosion of other sources of identity for individuals that are more collective or group identities. So traditional structures have diminished in their strength, but also more modern structures like labor unions and community groups have diminished in their strength. And I think that must feed agency panic, where agency isn't automatically assumed to be an individual, but also assumed to be an individual embedded in different kinds of communities. So then from there, my thinking goes to the kinds of identities that people derive from their participation in different kinds of democratic projects and efforts, including NGOs, including their identities as a student of STS, perhaps. My experience, turning to your specific question, Sheila, is like yours, that we have a lot of students from the life sciences cycling through the Center for Genetics and Society as interns. And what they say is so interesting. They're hungry to know about what the ones that show up at our door are hungry to know about the social consequences of what they're doing in the lab, and don't have a place for those conversations in their formal schooling. So that's one set of experiences that's been really striking. Another is that people are very interested in these issues, including Andrew Feenberg, the issue of enhancement. I wish I believed what you said was true, that there won't be much traction, but my experience tells me otherwise. And that's the case both because I have seen and have great respect in the sense of I see the power of the marketing that, for example, fertility clinics will do about how you can get the best start in life for your child to be, but you must act now because this is truly a once in a lifetime opportunity. But also because of the interest that people have in issues of heritable genome editing. And, you say the word designer babies to a room full of, in a public library setting or in a community group or in a classroom. And that's all you have to say. People are fascinated. They have lots to say. They have lots of questions. They have lots they want to put out and hear what other people think about. So I think that there is actually an untapped reservoir of interest and anxiety and hope about these issues, about many issues of science and technology, because it's so increasingly clear how thoroughly these matters determine who thrives and who doesn't, how they shape our lives. People see that. and they want to be engaged, and there's not good mechanisms or good habits in our democratic society about that engagement.
Thank you, Marcy. I guess it opens a door for the Global Observatory to catch the subjectivities before they're completely baked in, and to serve as that place of questioning, which we very much want to do. So Ben, you want to take it up from there?
Yeah, so the question that I have actually follows along very directly from Marcy and Andy's answers. And Jenny, I really liked your your giant telescope. And of course, the suggestion that a lot of money should be allocated to the building of this telescope. But of course, I mean, that metaphor, I think, actually raises two sort of questions. First of all, what does it take to build a telescope? Because, you know, as those of us who pay attention to the undertaking of, you know, the development of large projects in science and technology know perfectly well, it's not just money. It's also a sort of vision of what must be looked at, and also what must be ignored in the undertaking of the project in order to make it happen. And so that's one dimension. What does it take to build it? And number two, you know, where should it be trained? There is the looking outward dimension to those, you know, voices that would sort of otherwise go unheard, or those you know, those domains that would otherwise go unseen. But there's also, you know, along the lines of what Marcy was just talking about, looking inward. And it strikes me both you and Andrew Feenberg in your comments pointed to issues of the sort of architectures of separation, right? You know, the sequencing over here and the ethics over there. And Andrew, for you, it was sort of more the domain of science and the life world, that in which, you know, the one is the space in which you know, a kind of teleological imagination reigns, and it's present in some degrees in the spaces of science and technology, insofar as the public interest leaves its fingerprints upon the organization of those undertakings. But it strikes me that one of the crucial questions that's at stake here, if we train the telescope inwardly, are actually those teleological imaginations. I mean, the ideas of where we're headed, of progress, in effect. And of course, the metaphors surrounding science and technology, advancements in progress, in future orient. I mean, these all have a kind of teleological texture to them, in the sense that there is a science and technology, if we want to use the language of agency, you know, are imbued with a kind of agency that's taking us somewhere. And then at stake in that, of course, is a question of the good, right? Not always necessarily explicitly asked, maybe in a sense implied. I thought that came out really nicely, Jenny, in your Tuskegee story, in which there is an invitation, and a well-meaning invitation, for this community to participate in progress, even as at the same time their church is literally falling down. Which, you know, if you think about that metaphorically as well, also I mean, that makes for a very wonderful example. So my question is this: how should we think about, and what are the right ways in terms of thinking about inclusion? This is along the lines, Jenny, of your include the scientists junction. How should we think about the forms of inclusion that place on the table, that train the telescope upon the very imaginations of progress, that sit inside of the organization of the sort of politics of deliberation, particularly where those are often tacit and they're built into, to some degree, architectures of separation. Jenny, you started by pointing to a kind of consonance between American science and technology and its project of experimentalism and the democratic experiment itself. And so I would ask you two in particular, but the whole panel can certainly weigh in on how we should think about experimentalism in particular, because the project of the observatory is partly asking questions and seeking to engage in such experiment itself. Since there's a sense in which the architectures of separation predetermine, delimit who has the entry cards to participate in a conference, who belongs in a particular kind of experiment, scientific or democratic, and what imaginations of progress, what teleologies are sort of built in advance into those parameters of experimentation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben. I was hoping you would have all the answers to those questions, but I'll offer a few ideas. You know, in SDS, we've always been working, you know, against the winds of metaphysics. We're trying to do the institutional work against a very strong tide of philosophical opposition that wants to do opposition, you know, separation, the metaphysics of separation. And the things that I talked about, you know, are examples of that. And we all have our practical examples. I mean, Sheila taught us to be institutions change makers. And, you know, and that's a Foucauldian point too, that if you want to change knowledge, you have to change institutions too. I mean, those two things go together. In my own work, like how to train and how we focused on, you know, creating a training program where we're training at the graduate level. So we've chosen graduate students as individuals, subjectivities that are available for shaping. They're not like sedimented in, and providing opportunities. And this comes out, you know, partly because of my personal experience of being one of the scientists that would have taken Sheila's class and had my mind transformed and asked, well, what do I do now that I've just had my subjectivity broken? I need a site for it, you know, and I think that our young scientists and engineers are really allies of ours, many of them. And so how do we work with them? How do we create the institutional spaces where they can flourish? And how do we create working relationships across science and engineering, social sciences and humanities at those beginning levels, so that the change can continue to happen throughout careers? I mean, that's one answer that we've had. Now with the observatory, I'm interested in your answer to how to do that. I'm curious about your thinking about that. I think there ought to be multiple answers to that question. I don't think anyone has to, you know, the market on how to do this, if you want to use that language. There's so many opportunities in this space. There's so little happening. There's so great of a need, as Marcy pointed out, that I think that we should be trying in whatever way we can to build whatever telescopes we can. And what I like about the telescope, you know, metaphor, and I'm curious, I actually want to know how you came up with the idea of how you settled on that metaphor. But of course it's a vision one. It's like, how do we more powerfully see? And what kinds of lenses do we need? And as you rightly point out, you have to craft those lenses. They don't just like magically appear. So what's the craft of crafting that technology? And I like that you've picked a telescope. It is a technology. It's as technical as anything else. You know, and Alondra Nelson, when her acceptance speech of, you know, when she was accepting being appointed the first Deputy Director of Science and Society at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I think was a hopeful moment for all of us, she talked about the inclusion of diverse people in science and technology, all communities, bringing them to the table as a technical achievement. And I think that I think is the right way to be framing these things, as a way to try to combat that metaphysics of separation you were talking about. So I'm curious, I want to know what you all have to say about that. And I think there's multiple answers to that question.
Andrew, you're still muted.
Can I respond to Ben's
please.
Provocation? I was thinking about what Andrew Jewett called agency panic. The strange thing about agency panic in the United States is that it seems to provoke reactions. In other words, manifestations of agency. So I remember this from One-Dimensional Man from Marcuse in the 1960s. The more you told people that they were completely dominated by the system, the more angry they got and the more they acted up. So I think when we talk about the relation of the public to science and technology, of course, it's very important that there are scientists and other specialists who inform the public, but in the end, there's public action. And that's what you're looking for. That's what you hope to achieve by informing the public. and that public action takes the form of resistance to this domination by the system. And so that's what I was trying to talk about in my little conversation here. The nature of that public reaction and how it can interface with science and technology, which do, after all, have specificity as a kind of specialized craft with different rules from those of everyday life. I'm not sure I can remember the gist of Ben's original question, but I hope this is somehow relevant to it.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So it absolutely relevant to it. We will now take questions from the audience. I think that the themes that we've touched on so far are going to come up again and again, judging from the abundance of questions that are pouring into the Q&A. Please, by the way, keep adding them, and I'll invite Sheila to select the first one.
So the first one I'm going to select is one that's very dear to my heart, but it was both the first one and then a further one down, asked by Gabriela Arguedas. And she asks, one of the issues that worries me more as a Latin American person is the pervasive condescending attitude that dominates the way global North scientists and scholars, even STS scholars, bioethicists, philosophers, etc., listen to and interpret questions, preoccupations, and doubts situated in the global South. How can the Global Observatory help in deconstructing this historical tendency? So I need not point out why I, Sheila Jasanoff, might be particularly interested in this set of questions. And so I can tell you that when we imagined the observatory, this was one of the issues very much at the center of our minds. And what we need, though, is your help, the audience's help, and our target people, citizens' help in trying to rectify what, after all, is a baked-in state of affairs that's very ancient. And I can tell you the things that we're trying to do. So, Jenny, this relates to the metaphor question that you raised. It's interesting that when Nature took up our idea for an observatory, the artists translated that into telescopes. But the idea for the observatory, in my mind, actually comes more from the global South, Gabriela, that this idea of an observatory imagines citizens as observing their environment and not the person controlling some fancy, shiny instrument sitting in one place who is surveying the heavens. So two things: it's not the person with the shiny instrument, and it is not surveying the heavens. It is people surveying the earth from their lowly positions on earth and putting those views together to create a larger than themselves picture of the things that are going on. So we very much hope to serve that integration function. And it's going to be difficult because, among other things, language colonizes, and one reason why bioethicists may, despite themselves, end up appearing condescending goes back to this discussion of enhancing that was happening with Andrew Feenberg, for instance. The language in which the issues are framed has tended to be Northern and European, and particularly Anglophone. So the first way that an issue gets on the table is in terms of often terminology that's familiar to Anglophone philosophers who have been thinking about a set of logical questions and different ways of reasoning for a long time, and how these translate into other languages that may not see the human or the human condition in those terms to start with, that is going to be a problem. And I dare say that even between Spanish and Portuguese on the one hand and English on the other, there are very big differences. For instance, my French colleagues tell me it routinely takes at least 10% more space to say things in French than in English. And that is not because the French are noted for fuzzy language. In fact, they say tout ce qui est clair est français. So, you know, there's a huge amount of work to be done. But I think the metaphor of the observatory as something that is from the ground up and building from below rather than from the top down with lots of money thrown at a singular instrument. That is a philosophy of the observatory, and to bring that philosophy into real being, we need help. We need the help of people like Gabriela, who has raised this question, and the anonymous person who raised a Global South question right at the start as well. So sorry to preempt that question, but Marcy, I see you would like to say something about that as well.
Muted, there we go. Now am I unmuted? Yeah. 3 points come to mind that are specific to the conversation about heritable gene editing, although they do apply to others. One is that I think that part of the international conversation about human gene editing in particular has been, there's a lot of insertion since He Jiankui of this competing between national powers, kind of who's going to get ahead. And I think that is something we have to really be aware of. It's dangerous for so many reasons, and that I think, you know, will be pretty evident to all of us. But we don't need a race to the bottom among nations. So that's the first point. The second point is that we have been so struck in this conversation by the way that existing policy conclusions reached by many, many countries about heritable genome editing have been ignored. So in even the well-funded and carefully done reports that have been put out by the national academies of the US, the UK, and China, for example, you would never know that dozens of countries have already deliberated in their legislatures about heritable genome editing and come to the conclusion that it should be off limits. So, you know, we're a small, scrappy, underfunded public interest organization, but we, with colleagues, including Françoise Bayless, undertook to do a policy review. We looked at the laws of more than 100 countries. It turns out that over 70 of them already have come to this conclusion about not going down the road of heritable genome editing. And why is that really astonishing level of agreement among nations so widely ignored in the policy discussions that are going on? So those are, I think, further evidences of the importance of global inclusion, and that this conversation not be dominated by people in the global north, by privileged people in the global north in particular. But again, just to underline the point that has been made several times, Jenny most forcefully has made it, that we need diverse kinds of efforts, in some grounded in universities, some grounded in social movements, some grounded in policy, some grounded in scientific circles themselves, and they need to be funded. So even if you compare the funding support for the summits on human gene editing and the reports that have been written on human gene editing and are being written on human gene editing, with support given for other kinds of democratic engagement, it's, you know, so skewed. And you can't, I think it's just, to make it anything like real, that we're going to have an inclusive and meaningful public global debate, we just really need to be aware that it doesn't happen on its own. It has to be supported, materially supported.
I wonder if I could,
Jenny, go ahead.
Comment on that too. And I'm going to come back to Andrew's notion of agency panic, because I think there's a question about where is the agency in all of this. You know, like you know, nations can make proclamations, but to what extent do these democratic, even when they are democratic institutions, have any power or force anymore? And so where is the power and agency in the world? And is it a matter of bringing in diverse nations? I mean, Marcy's saying, look, you know, they're weighing in, but who's listening? And I think that, you know, it's been interesting to me to watch, even as the scientists, the very powerful scientists that I know and speak with, also talk about having no agency. You know, they're not being paid attention to either. And I think this is where I think, you know, the kind of like elephant in the room is I don't know if we want to call it late global capitalism or, like systemic intertwining of financialization. And let me just give you as an example, an ethnographic project we have going on right now on 3rd Street in San Francisco, which for any of you who know San Francisco, those used to be the former railroad, the dockyards for the shipyards, and they were just deserted in the 1970s and 80s. They were just wastelands. And then they got bought, the city was trying to revitalize them, and they gave UCSF some land, and UCSF, there was a big vision of recreating San Francisco on the backs of the biotechnology revolution and creating the idea would be the precision medicine campus. But that now has been subsumed, that plan got subsumed by Uber moving in and the big financial corporations that moved in, that meant that even the biotech companies didn't have enough money to buy those spaces anymore. So I think there's a question about where the agency is and what is the space of democracy, and can we even talk about that anymore, is a really critical question, across the globe at the moment.
So thank you very much for that, Jenny. I want to take up a question here that I think connects to this discussion very nicely, but by shifting it into the sort of temporal dimension rather than the spatial dimension. We've just been talking about the spatial dimension. At stake in both are the sort of conceptual, institutional, practical, habitual formations that sort of configure what form the conversation takes, where it starts, where it has traction or not, etc. So this is a question from Les Levideau. It's directed to Jenny specifically, but others can speak to it. How to stimulate debate on a technoscientific development at an early stage so that a collective intervention can open up the design and normative issues. As some critics have observed, it seems either seems too early or too late, by which time the influence can only be a compensatory ethics, except perhaps in trajectories where the design remains truly open or is strategically kept open. So there's a question about openings, and also a question about the ways in which the presumption of separation or temporal relations render interventions merely compensatory or merely reactive when they might be transformative otherwise. So Jenny, do you want to speak to that?
I mean, I think I named it as a problem. I won't say a lot about it. I do think it has to be designed in to keep it open. And it is, I think, one of the biggest problems we face. But I was just speaking, so I'm going to let others chime in.
I can say something about this. The big example is nuclear energy. By the time a public opposition developed that was strong enough to make a difference, the whole thing was already well established all over the world. And of course, that public opposition has now pretty much blocked the project, but it's awfully late. There's radioactive material accumulated all over the place in these dead power plants. Some actually are still functioning. So scientists tried in the early stages. There was something called the scientist movement. Scientists tried to influence nuclear policy. But there was a dual use situation. The scientists were mainly concerned about nuclear weapons, but they tended to be favorable to peaceful uses of atomic energy. And then that became the vector for proliferation. And in the case of genetic engineering, you have a similar situation between therapeutic and enhancement applications. Everyone is going to be for some kind of therapeutic application, but then that opens the door to the enhancement, just as nuclear power was the open door from nuclear weapons. So I don't know that there's really an answer to Les's question. It's simply something we can observe. In the end, the ability to block a project which has gotten finally become salient in public discourse is very important. And that's finally our last stand against projects that have gained a certain amount of momentum, but have bad consequences in the view of the public. And I don't really see, I mean, I can see that all the efforts that are being made by Sheila and Marcy and Jenny to stimulate interest among people who can activate a public, I can see that that's absolutely essential. But in the end, I'm not very optimistic about the ability to intervene at an early stage, unless there are, at some future time, there are fundamental changes in the organization of science and technology.
Thanks, Andrew. Maybe to move to a slightly more optimistic zone, here is a question that in a way talks about agency more on the politics side than on the scientific side. Andrew, I'm going to direct this, Andrew Jewett, that is, I'm going to direct this to you because you said something about the wearing away of institutions, and maybe you could discuss this from even a historical point of view. So this is from Iñaki Goni. It seems to me that there's a gap between discussions about ideals of public deliberation and empowerment and systematic knowledge of the sorts of technologies, quote unquote, dialogue, design, methods of enforcement, public subjectivities, analysis, policy co-design, etc., that materializes deliberation. Should there be more emphasis on the mundane aspects of the democratization of science? And if so, who and how should pick up the baton to close that gap? So, this is saying, what kinds of tools and instruments can be put in the hands of citizens to make them into better deliberators and holding people accountable. So I wonder if you have any insights into that, Andy.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I had written down a phrase that Marcy used, let's see if I have it right, about the divestment and the arts of collective judgment. And I think that's a fascinating phenomenon. I think, though, for all of the sort of glowing language about deliberation in the U.S., the process of how any sort of popular will is formed has been, largely ignored. I mean, it's just been imagined that it sort of pops out of nowhere. And so I do think we need to think very specifically about institutions, technologies, and so forth. But it takes me again back to the point that Jenny made about who gets included and when, and is that actually serving a legitimating function? At some point, is all discussion a contribution to a larger project of democracy? Or does it have, is there a conflict between the sort of outcomes of that deliberation, how it sits inside a larger political system, and the form of the immediate conversation where you may have people in a room talking to one another? So I think we need to work on both of those levels, not just enhancing our capacity in a technical sense, but also thinking about the questions of justice that Jenny raised as to how this is integrated. It reminds me a little bit of what Andrew just said about the scientist movement around nuclear power after World War II, because there it seemed clear that basically the federal government sort of trumped the scientists, right? And now, as Jenny is suggesting, the question now is also about trying to empower, democratic states in a sense. So there's a new dimension there as well.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, I have a question that I think we can direct to Marcy. This is a question from Liz Dietz, and it speaks to the sort of question of how imaginations of democracy themselves are at stake in in projects of democratization, particularly in relation to, as you put it, the sort of emphasis on social justice in your organization. I think you can answer this particularly well, because the challenge is, of course, to at once act in a political space and at the same time question the contours of that political space in ways that are politically productive. And so the question is, with respect to the sort of aspirations of democracy that are built into that project, given the fact that we're constantly failing to allow for democratic participation through failures of representation, systematic disenfranchisement, and more, beyond getting enough of the right people in the room, how should we think about what are the limitations and how we should we think about the limitations that we encounter in drawing upon democracy itself as a sort of productive, normative good?
What are the limitations of democracy?
I think the way to understand the question is, if democracy in practice is limited in ways that we're familiar with and are of course themselves contested in that context, part of the challenge of action is overcoming key limitations, recognizing and overcoming key limitations, but at the same time thinking about what democratization itself means. And so, I mean, the way I would translate the question for you is to ask, you know, in what ways is it productive to make that a direct focus of political action, of activism, and what are the constraints upon it if, for instance, one is having to take defensive action vis-a-vis vis-a-vis accusations of, for instance, being anti-science?
I think that I think it is the case that in our democratic institutions we have not built mechanisms or practices and habits of intervening in decisions that are presented as decisions about science and technology. So it's an extra barrier on issues like that. And on issues like the nuclear power analogy that's come up several times, which I think is really interesting to think about. But I think that advocacy groups and activist groups have crafted some tools that challenge democracy, and that we need social movements, NGOs need to be willing to use all of them. So if it's, you know, everything from, you know, the letters to the editor to the protests in the streets. I mean, you know, we imagined when we started the Center for Genetics and Society that there would be a whole ecology of efforts, an ecology of organizations on an issue as consequential as human germline modification. And, you know, will there someday be people rappelling down the Golden Gate Bridge with a no designer baby sign? I don't know. I mean, in a way, this might still be early days in the construction and the building up of a movement, a popular movement to put democratic controls and controls in the name of social justice on human biotechnologies. And it takes a long time for those kinds of movements to gather their strength. That was true of the nuclear power issues, certainly, and of environmentalism as a whole. There were, you know, all the disparate, you know, anti-litter and save the wildlife and the wilderness, and it came together as an environmental movement or ecology movement after many years of effort. So, you know, and this, relating back to this question of the temporality and when these interventions can and should and must be made, I think we're at really different temporal stages. Right now, there aren't a lot of moneyed institutional interests in heritable genome editing. We're before that stage. It's so different from when the movement against nuclear power really became strong. You know, right now, we can just say no pretty easily and we're not gonna gore anyone's hocks. But if we wait until the fertility clinics start offering and marketing these technologies, they already are offering related technologies, genetic selection technologies. So the financial interest is developing, but we're at the stage way before where we were at when the utilities were heavily invested in nuclear power. So I think I think it's going back to the question, we just have to be willing to use the tools of activism, advocacy, and I think that we can adapt some of the traditional democratic mechanisms, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and putting people who really think about social equity and social justice in charge of it, I think is certainly a step in the right direction. So there's some hope there.
Marcy, thank you for the reminder that activism is one of these keys in the door with which you can open up certain kinds of things. I'm going to take the liberty of taking two questions that are to some extent related to this and paired. They also both open up a theme that's been going through the questions and also in the things that you've all been saying, and that is what to do about the problem of the baked in. I mean, that is something that looks so durable, that how do you undo it? And maybe using pedagogy as a key instead of activism as a key. So I'm going to ask the first part of this to Andrew Feenberg and then the second part to Jenny. But Jenny, it begins with you. From David Spanagel, and excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. I assigned one of Jenny Reardon's papers to my Intro to the History of Sci-Tech class last fall, and asked those students to reflect on her work with respect to this question: how can scientific investigations of human variation and/or the development of new biotechnology tools ever effectively dismantle prejudices that are deeply rooted in existing unequal power relationships? And Marcy, I realize you've given a partial answer, but so now I wonder if any of today's panelists have related thoughts about the interactions of any democracy's prevailing attitudes with emerging scientific ideas and technologies. And Andrew, I was wondering if you would care to reflect on this from the standpoint of your work on Marcuse, or from any standpoint. So just to repeat, interactions of any democracy's prevailing attitudes with emerging scientific ideas and technologies. So I'm asking Andrew to respond to that. And then Jenny, this in a way continues that discussion, a question from Hilton Simmet that says, Andrew Jewett and Jenny Reardon mentioned American political culture, and Jenny Reardon talked about the metaphysics of separation. I wanted to ask how these comments relate to American civic epistemology. So then again, there's baked in the ideology of turning debates about values into questions of fact. If scientists are the gatekeepers of fact, how can we overcome the standpoint of American civic epistemology? As a student at Harvard Kennedy School, it's not often one finds people reading Foucault and thinking about leading through techniques and tools. So Jenny, maybe you could respond to that half of the Americanness and durability question. So Andrew, you first on democracy and emerging science and technology.
Okay. I'm not sure that I fully understand the connections between the different parts of the question, but the last part I can respond to. There is a historic tendency to think of science and technology as completely autonomous. They are functions of truth, and truth is something which is outside of human control. It's just what is. And that tendency, which we inherit from an earlier era, is countered increasingly in the last, say, since the 1970s, by various forms of public intervention into science and technology. And by this, I mean not just the usual policy interventions that governments have always been engaged in ever since they began funding science and technology, but I mean direct action by the public, which challenges the autonomy of science and technology. It's not just on the fringe, say, giving a little money here and a little money there, but rather altering the actual workings of science and technology. I mean, I first encountered this with the pregnancy of my wife, when women demanded at that time the right for the partners to enter the delivery and labor rooms. And that was an absolute no-no for the medical establishment, but the public pressure has actually resulted in a change in practice. And these kinds of changes in the actual workings of science and technology have become more commonplace in the time since those days, those early days in the 70s. And I think this does augur a different, ultimately a different relation of science and technology to society, which will be institutionalized in new forms. But we don't really know what shape that will take, because the dominant ideology still holds to this notion of autonomy. And it's not clear how to institutionalize public involvement without empowering anti-intellectual forces in the society, irrational forces, which have come to the fore, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. So we're in a kind of interregnum, and we don't know exactly where this will lead, but somehow science and technology are going to become public issues in a way that law is. And we'll have to see how that's institutionalized in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. And Jenny, on metaphysics of separation, pedagogy as an alternative to mind changing, and on reading You versus Foucault.
Sorry.
You're muted, Jenny. There you go.
Am I okay? Sorry. These are softball questions people are throwing at us. So let me just say something about this. I imagine that everyone on this who's speaking we're not just academics opining, writing pieces about these things, reading books. We're in institutions, and Marcy, most actively of all of us, but we're all in our own ways on the ground doing this work. And there are many lessons I think we could offer from all that work, which is hard work and often frustrating work. But I think that, how do you deal with these really entrained, as Sheila said, baked in, I've referred to it as metaphysics to give it weight, problems, I think, is by finding the spots where there are practical problems that need to be solved, that you can find alignments, with, say, in my case, my science and engineering colleagues. I mean, increasingly, and combined with leadership from the top. So I do think there's a role for democratic institutions, like, when the Biden-Harris administration came in and said, societal issues are going to matter. And when NIH starts implementing new policies about, you can't just do your science anymore and not think about what the name keeps changing, but societal impact, and we don't like that. That's the wrong metaphysics, right? So, but at least there's a space where we start talking to our scientists and engineering colleagues. I think where I've been able to make the most difference is where there's an alignment over a shared set of values. I often say, I don't know of any genome scientist or any biologist who went into it to create the next generation of racism or biocolonialism. And so there is a shared aspiration often to do the good thing, to push forward on a social justice agenda. But increasingly, I think the problems that Andrew Jewett has been talking about are working against us, because even when I find alliances, in, say, for example, here at the University of California, increasing philanthrocapitalism is what drives things. Who has the big check they're going to write, to our university. And so I end up feeling like very old-fashioned and want to argue for the need for, universities that don't have to depend on getting these large checks, and where there is a societal investment in a public institution that supports truly engaging in contentious ideas. And I don't know quite how to, I'm going to sound old-fashioned, but I don't know how else we do it if we just cede all the public institutions and allow, there's this great inequality that we now have in the worldwide between those who have a very small, the very tiny percent of people who control most of the money. And Ben, this goes back to your point about the telescope requiring money. And it was interesting, Sheila, that you didn't actually, I didn't realize that backstory, but let's just go with the telescope. Obviously you don't just need a big check, because money, what is money? I give an intro lecture on money in my Issues and Problems in American Society program, and I pull out dollar bills out of my pocket and I say, is this money? But what is money other than the values we give it? Money is value, and in the broadest sense. And until we, I think, confront those issues, science is the latest terrain on which this deeper problem of governance and existence is playing out. It's the contemporary terrain, and more people are getting hip to the fact that they should be on that terrain. But I think the deeper problems are there are a lot of deeper problems here, basically. So did I solve it?
I actually want to.
Jenny.
Yeah, totally, always, Jenny. So actually, Jenny, I think that is a really nice segue into the questions that I want to bring in, which are a hybrid or chimerization of 3 different questions. And part 1, I want to direct towards Andrew Jewett, and then part 2 towards Andrew Feenberg. So the first question is this. I mean, Jenny, you were calling for a sort of return to public institutions, but there's also a question of the ways in which, the forms which the public interest and those institutions that represent the public take form. Andy, this is a question from Kinley Gillette about the ways in which the sort of question is, as a historical matter, has agency panic been a basis for the embrace of new technologies, or I would guess I would add new technocracies? That is, for example, the embrace of a technocratic politics to solve problems like anthropogenic climate change, where the problem of agency is profoundly confronted, reaching for the, you might say, sort of transcendent authority of science embodied in the form of expertise, and maybe rendering tractable a problem by drawing it down into a form that's actionable, maybe through locating it in a smaller number of hands that act, on the basis of the authority of knowledge. So I wonder if you would say something about the dynamics of expertise in the context of the comments that you made earlier. And then, Jenny, money is value, but it's also a currency. And there is a sense in which there's a question about, what is the world's reserve currency in the domain of confronting questions of the sort that are at stake with respect to human genome editing that touch upon humanity itself. And so, Andrew, I would ask if you would comment a little bit on the sort of formations of science as such that sit at the level of the international. And this is a kind of combination of questions from Guillaume Levray and Craig Calhoun. Craig writes very nicely, part of what it takes to build a telescope is international diplomacy. Let's substitute large technological projects for telescope. All such major ones are transnational projects. And Guillaume asks, how should we think about the conventions and the conventionalisms that get deployed at the level of the international that may constrain or configure or channel a more textured and complex national politics when it comes to the level of asking and answering problems at the level of the international? One of the dynamics that is currently playing out around genome editing is sort of seeking to identify what are the right questions at the international, and at least in some quarters, there's been a coalescence on regulation, which is in a sense also a coalescence upon identifying universal placeless forms of expertise that can identify and answer questions that will solve the problems for all times and all places, but that is an elevation of particular situated institutions to the level of the universal that in effect produce a kind of currency that carries along with it the forms of value that are attached to it. So Andrew, I wonder if you would say something for us about how you see, how we should think about science and that context, science in relation to universality and therefore the global. So Andrew Jewett first.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think, you know, there are certain kinds of flaws with the way that Melly lays out the kind of agency panic sort of model. And it's very clearly specific to certain kinds of texts and certain sorts of films and so forth. I think the question of what kind of reaction it provokes, and Andrew Feenberg talked about this a little bit as well, is a complicated one, because I think this kind of core anxiety can push people in a lot of different ways. One of them that Melly brings out, and that you sort of were spot on with, Andrew, about the Marcuse point, is a kind of totalized rejection of the system that is imagined to be oppressing one, and a sense in which somehow one needs to free oneself entirely from the social in order to be a kind of authentic agent, and a kind of total refusal. But other ones that he doesn't address, and that I think are probably more common in a way, have to do with relocating agency to other actual people. And so if we think about science as one of these kinds of systems, you know, one way is to imagine it as this kind of super agent, but I think probably as common, more common, is to ascribe agency to the people who sort of inhabit that institution. And that can go in the direction of either all of the scientists, they have the power and I don't, or some small elite of scientists has the power and I don't. And then once you start thinking about small elites having power, if that becomes a kind of generalized image of how social relations work, then it's very easy to take that technocratic turn and to say, well, my small group of people ought to be in power, right? And we need to cut through some of these kinds of mechanisms, and we just need the right sort of lever pullers to be there pulling the levers. I mean, it's not particularly apropos to the climate change issue, but that kind of, you know, you can see that in certain styles of populism, you can see it, but also in certain, you know, kinds of conspiracy thinking. But there is that tendency to say, well, you know, no, there is never any democracy. Things are always run by just a few people. And so we just need to get a few of the right people in charge.
So, thank you, Andy. I see our time is, as is inevitable, running out. I'm going to make one observation drawn from the comments, and then maybe just time for one more question of a combined sort, and then give it back to Ben to begin the wrap up for this afternoon. So Phil Loring asks, what about the UK style of mass observation as a metaphor for the observatory we seek to create? And then he points out they set out to capture all the varied textures and genres of everyday life under the new frontier technologies. So this mass observation project, I mean, it's interesting because it uses that word observation, and it talks about everyday life, but there was obviously an eye behind the photographer who was carrying out the documentary photography. I think I'll take that as a very interesting injunction to us as people trying to design a space of observation, to keep in mind that there are these other modalities of observation, and maybe come back to that as a future topic for the observatory. But in that connection, a couple of people have raised questions about private money. So one of the most recent comments on this was from Anna Fritz. What of the private sector, specifically the leadership of the celebrity billionaire whose personal wealth can outspend most nations? And, you know, we're all familiar with things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. I assume that these are the kinds of institutions that people have in mind. Marcy, since you're based on the West Coast, and California has this long tradition of referenda, and some of these referenda have seen a lot of mobilization of private money coming to one side or another of different causes, and things have been voted down that out of a progressive point of view, you might have not wanted to see voted down. I mean, so I don't know what your institution's position was on labeling genetically modified food products, for instance, but that was one example that comes to mind where the food industry galvanized to put private money behind things. But this is, Anna's question is putting this in a more, in a way that to some degree cuts back across toward Andrew Jewett as well. But let me ask you how you deal with this influx of the private through capital as colonizing particular positions, modes of thought, and can outspend governments to some degree in the way they frame questions and the kinds of outcomes they want to see happen as well.
There is certainly no easy answer to that question. And the referenda in California, Jenny, I don't know if you'd agree with this. I think they are so manipulated by money at this point that there's growing cynicism about their claims to be democratic. I don't know what more to say about that, but I do think that the obscene increase in private sequestering of money and the rise of inequality that we've seen, even exacerbated in the pandemic, is one of the things, in addition to the Trump era, the rise of authoritarianism, the resurgence of white supremacy, that I think has disrupted any complacency that we have had over recent decades, or between World War II and recently, about the future of democracy. That we know it now, that it's not ensured, that there are existential threats in challenges that have science and technology at their core, like the climate crisis. There are real threats to democracy. I think that human heritable genome editing is one of them. So I think we've given up our complacency about the future of democracy, but I don't know if we've given up our complacency yet about all the ways in which these issues with science and technology at their core are really implicated and imbricated in those threats. And I think that the work that we have to do, which takes into account these imbalances of power and money that all of us are trying in our ways to grapple with, are just so important.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to begin the wrap up?
Yeah, so we've talked about the building of a giant telescope. The other day, my daughter was making a little homemade kaleidoscope with a toilet paper roll and a mirror and so forth. And I've been thinking about how she dropped little things into it and looked through and could see the fractal-like transformation of those things from a kind of multiple angles simultaneously. And it strikes me that maybe the better metaphor for what's in the tower is a kaleidoscope than a telescope. And that this conversation has been one of what will be a series of conversations, each of which seek to drop more and more elements into our kaleidoscope, such that we can see them in ways we haven't seen them before. The project of the observatory is to take what we see and carry it forward to continue the conversations in multiple sort of iterative and sustained ways. And so in that sense, this has been a wonderful contribution, not just in itself, but to what is an emerging and ongoing project. And so I would like to thank the panelists for the wonderful remarks that they've made, and the audience for their excellent contributions, and assure you all that those of us who are seeking to push this effort forward have taken away many lessons from this, and ideas that will hopefully seed future activities along these lines. And given that, I invite you all to take note of the message that Alistair Sponsel put in the chat. Please sign up for the mailing list on our website. And if you have further inquiries about the observatory and other possibilities of participating in its activities, please feel free to send a message to Alistair about it. And so thank you to the panelists and to the audience, and I will turn it over to Sheila for the final goodbyes.
Yes, well, first of all, let me second Ben in thanking all of our panelists for this wonderful contribution, each in your bits of colored glass that you sprinkled into our gray April Cambridge day. So thank you very much for that. Andy, your work, among others, reminds us that America is not just a place of baked-inness, but also a place of experimentation. And it's very much in that spirit that we're approaching the observatory. And I was really heartened to see all of the questions, even if we couldn't possibly get to all of them in this format. And certainly in my own experimentation mode, it has given me lots of ideas for how to go about soliciting the questions. One of the principles of philosophies of the observatory, it should be a philosophy of good policymaking generally, is that the best answer to the wrong question doesn't get you very far. So you have to be sure that you're asking the good questions. But how do you ask good questions? And I think that the Q&A today is indicative of the kinds of questions that people are raising. And we will do our very best going forward to do more than we already have done on the observatory website to make sure that we're welcoming of questions and have figured out ways of addressing what people bring to us. So in the spirit of democratizing not just answers, but also questions. And also in this, one person raised the term radical hospitality, but I think to me, radical hospitality means being able to spend time with good friends, not measured out in 5-minute increments. I would like to thank you for devoting 2 hours on a Friday to this enterprise, and really we're immensely grateful, and we'll come back to all of you and to the audience as we move this project forward. Thanks very much, and thank you, Alistair.